a pleasure to be here today, and I'd like to talk to you about a topic that all of us at Ablon feel very passionate about, and that is the subject of the triple bottom line, how businesses can work beyond just making money, how businesses can contribute to environmental sustainability, how businesses can contribute to environmental sustainability, how businesses can make livelihoods better for the people at the bottom of the pyramid. I'm only going to use some slides that you see up there fleetingly, just to give you some visual representations. But what I really want to do is to tell you the story of how Ablon evolved. And I think there are important lessons to be picked up for all of us. Let me begin by telling you a little bit about my own story around the time I started Ablon. I come from an Indian business family. My father started a pharmaceutical business many years ago. Till today, it's one of India's biggest pharmaceutical companies in its domain, fairly globally spread. When I joined the business, I started with the thought that I would spend the rest of my life here. I had no vision beyond it, as typically happens with children of business families. This is what we were brought up to do, and here I am doing it. I spent almost 5 years in that business, learning about the pharmaceutical industry, learning diverse aspects within it. And then came an inflection point in my life. Around 2007-2008, our family decided to diversify into other areas. And by some stroke of luck, I was put in charge of that initiative. It started as a very logical process, as business groups usually do. What are we good at? What are our strengths? How can we replicate those strengths? What are the areas or sectors that are growing within the country, within the world? And hence, how do we build a new business? But I tried to go beyond the logical process. And I realized very strongly that here is an opportunity that not many people get at that age, where having worked for some years, you get a chance to redefine your life. I'm sure many of the people who have come here with work experience would have a similar feeling. You have been doing something before, but here you are getting exposed to a whole new world. And this becomes an inflection point where you can really redefine what you do with your life. I tried to dig very deep and find out what really excited a group of us, not just me. It was a collective process with a senior team. And two very clear answers came, which has really become the philosophical base of what Ablon stands for today. The first part was the power of entrepreneurship, how entrepreneurship and business can contribute to creating jobs, to growing the economy, to creating opportunities not only for the business group but for a wide variety of people in society. But the second thing that excited me was the whole prospect of contributing to change. We saw a vision of India as a country. We are a rapidly growing country, but we are also very, very deficient in resources. If you look at some macro statistics around India, India now has about 18% of the world's population today. And this 18% of the world lives in about 2% of the world's land. It has access to about 3% of the world's energy resources and about 1% of the world's fresh water. So can you imagine that when people come into the mainstream, when there is a growing middle class, what sort of pressure that puts on the use of natural resources, energy, water, all resources. If we take the example of milk, India has always been a milk exporting country, but in the past 5 years, 2 of the 5 years, India has had to import milk. A lot of people think of this as importing milk, but actually what the country is doing is importing water. India can't make enough milk because it does not have enough water to grow fodder, to feed its cows and generate more milk. So in various ways we realized that the Western model of development could not work in a country like India. As we went beyond India, we saw a similar situation in many parts of the world. In Africa, in all the developing countries. And interestingly, we saw similar situations coming in the developed countries also, where they were trying to redefine their energy usage equation, their water usage equation, and so on. But here came a contradiction. On one side, I mentioned that we wanted to be in business, we wanted to be in entrepreneurship. On the other side, we were excited by the prospect of change. All of us usually think of this as a contradiction. It's either this or that. But thinking about it more deeply, we thought that maybe the two objectives can be merged. And we were inspired strongly by Mahatma Gandhi, who is the hero of India, his philosophy, which he stated in the 1920s and 30s. All of you know that in the 30s, this was the time period just before World War II, where the Industrial Revolution was at its peak. Every country was trying to build a bigger airplane, a tank, weapons, engineering. That was the whole direction of the world. And here was a man who at that point of time raised the subject of sustainability. All of us know him as a freedom fighter, somebody who got India's freedom. But he was much more than that. He went to every village and he said, how can I make this village self-sufficient in every sense? Some of you may have come across the famous image of Mahatma Gandhi on his spinning wheel. And that's really a symbol of empowerment. What he said was, can we make every artisan a business person? Can we give him the tools to create his own livelihood? And can we make every village self-sufficient? Hence, when we were arriving at our business model, we said that let us pick a business which has large local impact. It can be in any part of the world. It does not have to be in India. It could be in Africa, it could be in the Middle East, but wherever it goes, it needs to have a large local impact. We scanned a lot of sectors and we zeroed in on bioenergy. When we think of bioenergy, it has a very different definition in the West. Typically, you would think of bioethanol, biodiesel, transport fuels, bio-oil, pyrolysis. These are the sort of buzzwords that you keep coming across when you think of the developed countries. But when you think of the developing countries, if you ask a villager his definition of bioenergy, he will probably say firewood. And he will probably say that I walk 2 hours every day, usually it's the women in the house who do it, to go and collect firewood just for that day. And if I'm lucky, I get it, or else I have to make do without it. And it becomes a point of community dispute, could lead to riots, so many other ills that are associated around it. And we thought to ourselves that here is an ecosystem that already exists. If we think of other technologies like solar or wind and so on, they are new ecosystems. They are new technologies which need to be brought to every community. But bioenergy was an ecosystem that was already existing. People collected biomass, they were using biomass. And the question we pose to ourselves is, how do we make this process more efficient? How do we make this process more industrial? And the answers we came to were very, very interesting. I'd like to take you through some of those answers. What was the first thing we did when we began to think of this idea? We did not put up a manufacturing unit. We did not start sales. We first set up a research lab. And the only thing that the research lab did was collect a variety of biomass and analyze it. I strongly feel even today that when people think of bioenergy, they think of inventing new forms of bioenergy. Whereas we are not doing enough to better understand the forms of biomass that we already have, that is already available, and how best we can use it. Can all of you guess what are the various sources of biomass available in society? Has anybody thought of it deeply? When you drive on a road, you see agriculture around you, you see forestry around you. Can you imagine the quantum of waste that is generated in these processes? In the part of India we come from, the state of Gujarat, for example, cotton is a very widely grown crop, as it is in so many parts of the world, in Egypt and so on. Some of you may have seen a cotton crop growing. Once the cotton is picked, the cotton is a white ball that you see on top of that stem. Once that white ball is picked, what happens to the rest of the material? Nobody knows, and nobody has thought about it. The tough answer is that even today it is put in a heap by farmers and it is burnt. And there is no alternative to this. The farmer has to worry about clearing the land for the next crop. He does not have the luxury of waiting, and there is no better process of disposing it. Can you imagine what happens when billions of tons of waste gets burnt in open fields? The kind of pollution that is released, the kind of respiratory diseases that it causes. Incidentally, India is the biggest hub of tuberculosis, which is a respiratory disease, and it is estimated that 60% of all Indians are affected by latent tuberculosis. 60%. When you think of forestry, all of us know, all of us get our furniture that comes from a lumber mill, from a sawmill. There is a whole chain to that process. But what about the waste that is generated through this process? When a tree is cut, not all of the tree is usable. It is probably the main stem, the main part of the tree, the central trunk that is used. What about the branches? What about the bark? What about the lobes and tops? Similarly, when I think of city waste, there is so much biological waste that is available. When I think of livestock, rearing cows or chicken and so on, there is so much waste that is generated. So that there is a wide spectrum of waste that is generated by society, and the reason why we have not been able to tap it is that we have not been able to think of an efficient conversion process. If it's not been done so far, there is obviously a reason why it's not been done. Let me take you to a picture that will tell you a little bit about it. Do you see the small truck with the heap on it? This is how biomass is transported in India, even today. Can you imagine why this is so? Why it is such a big heap? It's because the material is very light. If you take a typical truck can hold about 20 tons of material. If you fill it up with cotton stalk, which is the example I mentioned, the full 20-ton truck will get full, housing only 2 tons of material. Can you imagine what that does to your logistics cost? If you fill a 20-ton truck, it is using the same amount of fuel, you are paying the driver the same salary, all your costs are the same. And instead of getting divided on 20 tons, they get divided on 2 tons now. This is the challenge around biomass. It is very low value material, it is very light, and therefore it is difficult to transport. When businesses come to this conclusion, they put a full stop. They say it is very difficult to transport and hence we cannot do it. But the answer is that it is difficult to transport for businesses, not for communities. Communities have been doing this for the past 200 years, as you see in this example. Hence, the second step we took after the research process was to set up a sourcing network. How do we get access to this biomass? And I will tell you an interesting story of what we found. Our first attempt was to take this truck to a farm and to tell the farmer to load the truck. We were aiming, this was a small truck, so we were aiming to get about 2 tons of material in that truck. When the farmer loaded that truck, we got about half ton. So we got only 25% of what we had estimated. And a lot of us went into a tizzy. We said, how do we solve this? How can this work? At these sort of numbers, it is just not feasible. We thought of another idea. we said let's empower a group of entrepreneurs, of people from this community. And we caught hold of these entrepreneurs and we said that here is an opportunity for you to make money. We will pay you so much to bring this material to us, and you figure out how this can be optimally loaded. In that experiment, the tonnage went up to 1.2 tons. So vast improvement. And we realized this came because we put the ownership in the hands of somebody from that community. But it was still only 60% of what we had assumed. We went a step further and we said, who is actually loading that truck? The guy who is loading that truck is the guy who works on the farm. Right? He is the laborer on the farm today. And we said, let us empower that laborer to fill this truck. And we tried doing that. We appointed entrepreneurs from that group and we said, bring your friends, do this, we will pay you, this is an opportunity for you to earn. And the answer we got was 2.5 tons on that 2-ton estimate. Because when you put power in the hands of the guy actually doing the job, not somebody viewing from the top, somebody who is actually doing it by his own hands, that is when you start getting these results. Our costs went down dramatically. We were loading 20% higher than what we estimated, and it suddenly became a viable process. This had a lot of challenges. There was one village where the team of laborers started earning more than the farmers in a season. And it caused a lot of unrest because the farmer came back and said, hey, this guy used to work for me. How can he make more money than me? There is a very deep hegemony, a social hegemony in these processes, which we tend to overlook. Hence, we try to invest in a lot of social processes, educational processes, working with the farmers, working with the communities to make them aware of what is really happening here. And hence, we were able to partly overcome this process. Today, we are at a point of time where we work with almost 300 villages in Gujarat. We work with almost 10,000 people who are directly or indirectly related in this effort. We have developed a group of almost 150 entrepreneurs who in the true right are business people. And when you will look at what these entrepreneurs do, they continuously improve. Every season, every 3 months, we have found that their loading process, their tonnage, their wastage has improved dramatically. And this was a huge learning for us, that this is not a process only about moving from conventional energy to renewable energy. It's a process of social involvement, and that is the real promise of renewable energy. Taking power back from the hands of big generators, big business, big companies, and spreading it, distributing widely into the communities. So we are very proud of what we were able to achieve. All of you get a view of the kind of supply chain that we had to manage to come to our plant. The next focus that we tried to lay was, what do we do with this biomass? We had a lot of knowledge, and let me tell you how this knowledge works in funny tacit ways. So for example, one of the steps in using the cotton stalk is to chip the cotton stalk. You need to cut it and make it small chips. When you do that, there is a cost of that process, and that cost is largely the power consumed by the machine to be able to chip it. We found that when we worked with cotton vis-a-vis cumin, vis-a-vis groundnut or any other crop, just by adjusting the angle of the blade of the chipper, we were able to reduce power consumption by 20%. And we did not find this. The entrepreneur running the machine, one of the 150 entrepreneurs, found this. We saw the results that guy was generating, and we were able to replicate those results across the entire spectrum of entrepreneurs. So that is the other point that I want to make, that when we think of renewable energy, we think in very high-tech terms. We think that there is going to come a product which will cause a revolution and the world will change. At least we don't believe things work that way. Renewable energy can fulfill its promise only if a lot of people put their minds together and make incremental improvements, make incremental progress. And there is so much wastage around us that there is a lot of such progress that needs to be made. When we were thinking about this question, what do we do with this biomass? There are a lot of technologies that are available. I am sure all of you have heard of it. We can incinerate the biomass, generate power. We can use pyrolysis to generate bio oil out of it. We can make biofuels like ethanol. There are so many technologies that are available. But we were very wary of this. We thought, let us use a technology which is the common minimum, which does the minimum amount of work to make that biomass eligible to be used. That is all that we wanted to do. And that is when we decided to make pellets. And these are the pellets that we make today. I don't know how many of you have seen physically what a pellet looks like. It's a very simple looking conjecture. I have one with me right here. Very simple. Nothing high tech. Essentially, it's this biomass that's been densified by a machine. It is nothing else. And hence, it's a fairly simple process as compared to a lot of high-tech technologies that are available today. We felt that the first job that needs to be done around biomass is to standardize it. If you think of the solar industry today, the solar industry is marching ahead because somebody thought of a unit which is a module or which is a watt peak. If you think of solar pricing today, solar pricing is on a watt peak. So if I am an application developer, I want to make a solar phone charger, I want to make any device that runs on solar. My denominator is very clear. I know what is the cost going to be because I know the cost per watt peak. That is what standardization does to a domain. It makes it democratic. It opens it up to a wide spectrum of developers who may not have had access to the same technology that a few special people would have. So we created these pellets that became a standard form of biomass. When we were talking to users, that why don't you use biomass? There is this waste resource available. Why don't you use it for heat, for steam in your boilers? Instead of coal, it may actually be cheaper for you, it is good for the environment. They came with very interesting observations. They said that when we collect biomass, when we collect agriculture waste, for example, there is no way of knowing whether each truckload is going to be the same. One truckload may be very high energy, the second one could have been sprayed with a lot of water for some reason, could have been left out in the rain. A third one could have a lot of sand within it. It could have been exposed to a sandstorm, a mini sand. So there is no way of knowing what every truckload is going to bring. And when that happens, when you put it in a machine, the machine's reliability goes for a toss. So one of our clients, for example, is Coca-Cola. And Coca-Cola uses these pellets to generate steam. And they use this steam to purge the bottles, to sterilize the bottles in a way before they fill it up. And they said that if I get one truckload of low calorie biomass, and if my pressure goes down, if my steam pressure goes down, the amount of loss on that batch of Coca-Cola is more than the entire year's saving using biomass. So we were very conscious of this fact that customers were looking for standard solutions, standardized solutions, and if we were able to achieve this, it would open this up to a very wide spectrum of developers. Hence we started making pellets. Pelleting technology 5 years ago was only suitable for wood residue. That was the only material that had been stabilized by technology providers. When we worked with agriculture residue, there were very different challenges. With agriculture, it is very difficult to control what is really there in that biomass. It could depend on the level of salinity of the soil, what sort of water was used, what sort of fertilizer was used. So we got a very different spectrum of biomass, and we laid a lot of effort to screen it, to clean it, to chip it, to densify it. But we made sure that when that pellet came out of the production process, it was always the same. It was always less than 2% ash, it was always less than 10% moisture, it was always 4,000 kilocalorie plus per kg. So we succeeded in creating a very standard product. And I think there began the revolution. The next step became so profound that it took most of us by surprise, which is when we were able to get into these devices. If we look at applications of biomass, then most of us in the industry agree that the best application of biomass is not power, it is heat. And wind and solar are less capable of generating heat as compared to generating power. So when we look at the basket of renewable sources, then biomass is best used to generate heat. Now India is a hot country in terms of weather. So we don't need space heating, unlike Europe, but we do need a lot of heat for cooking. And this is where we started launching our first range of cook stoves. They started as very crude models, but progressively got more and more sophisticated. To do this, we again went back to the process on the ground. How does firework cooking work today? How does the person aggregate biomass? What is the kind of device that the person uses to burn it? What are the efficiencies? If we think of the gas stoves that we use today, conventionally, most of us use, these gas stoves are at about 40% efficiency. So 40% of all the energy generated gets transferred into the food, right? So that's the benchmark efficiency in the world today. When we looked at firewood, the level of efficiency at which they were burning was 8 to 12%. 8 to 12%, which meant that you needed to use 4 times as much firewood to be able to get as much cooking heat as using gas. That also has implications for time. It means you need to cook it a lot longer. And hence we said that our mission now should really be to make this process more efficient, make biomass cooking more efficient. We were not bothered about price. We were not bothered about the cost to the consumer. We said, let's get the efficiency piece of the puzzle right, and that will lead to the whole equation solving itself. So when we created these stoves, we did not create them as regular stoves. We took the design of a boiler. If you think of a thermal boiler today, and how does a thermal boiler achieve 80% efficiency? Essentially, we miniaturized that boiler and we put most of that technology into this small cook stove. And as a result, the efficiencies we started achieving were upwards of 35%. So we were now very, very close to gas. This has sparked such a big change in Indian society that it's hard to comprehend the extent of this revolution. Today, every day, we sell about 20 such cook stoves to commercial users who then use these pellets throughout the year. And by the end of this year, we would have displaced about 0.25% of India's cooking gas consumption just by our pellets. Our aim is that in the next 3 years, we could have displaced up to 3% of India's gas consumption only by our pellets. And there are others joining in the industry, and hence my estimate is that in the next 3 to 5 years we could go as high as displacing 10% of India's gas consumption by using these pellets. When we think of this change, we are tempted to think that it's a revolution. It's happened very quickly. It happened very suddenly. Somebody thought of a brilliant idea and it happened. But the hard truth is that it happened very slowly. It happened very sequentially, step by step. We started with the research process. We started with the biomass process. We were then able to standardize the biomass, and we were then able to make the devices that are ultimately able to use. So when all of these pieces of the puzzle come together, that's when the big change starts to happen. Incidentally, this business remains very profitable for us because gas prices are so high that even by providing a 30% saving to the customer, which is a large saving for somebody who does cooking commercially, a 30% saving to the customer, we are still able to make very healthy EBITDA margins. Which means the first point of what I started out with, which is the whole domain of entrepreneurship and business and change, were really able to come together. Beyond this, as a company, we have diversified into other areas. When we started collecting this biomass, we felt that some of this biomass has very high nutrition content when we started analyzing it. So why use something with high nutrition content as fuel? Why burn it as fuel? Hence we started making organic fertilizer. Even within organic fertilizer, we took a novel approach. If you look at the fertilizer industry today, they know only 3 letters, NPK. Those are the 3 nutrients that all fertilizers use. And this is a one-size-fits-all approach. So we said, can we make this customized on each crop? Can we make a specific fertilizer for banana, for apples, for cotton, which is tailored for the specific needs of banana? We launched our first product 2 years ago, and within the state of Gujarat, it's got acceptance, very good acceptance among the banana growers community. These are pictures of some of the facilities that we have built in India. We have also been successful in rolling out this business globally. So we have not restricted ourselves to India. We set up a plant in Canada, which is this plant that you see today, where the industry is much more mature. We started operations in Europe, and we found that in all of these countries, the same dynamics exist. Gas is expensive, pellets are a cheaper alternative. In these countries, there are additional subsidies and advantages to using renewable energy. Hence, a large part of the market is now moving to bioenergy. I like to think of this as a silent revolution. It is a silent revolution because all of us don't hear about it every day, right? We hear about big solar PV plants being set up. We hear about windmills being set up. We don't hear about biomass being used. Yet, if you go to a country like Italy, about 7% of Italy's needs now come from biomass. If you go to a country like Sweden, about 60% of all of Sweden's transport needs now come from biomass. If you look at companies like Fortum and others, district heating companies in Sweden, they are using a wide variety of biomass. Another very interesting thing happened in Europe. Once we were able to, the whole industry was able to standardize these pellets, they discovered another very interesting thing. They were able to use these pellets in an existing coal plant. And this was a very, very big breakthrough, because this meant that to fulfill a renewable obligation for a company, instead of setting up a new windmill, they were able to just replace the fuel in the same coal plant. And this has led to a very big boom in the industry. This is probably the project that is closest to my heart, which is our first venture into Africa. We evaluated Africa very deeply. We visited almost 12 countries, and post that process we zeroed in on Ghana as the country where we would set up our first operation. We went to a city called Kumasi, which is the second biggest city of Ghana post the capital, in the interiors of Ghana. It is very interesting if you look at the urban architecture of that city. There is a city, big city, and in the center of the city is a landfill. In the absolute center of the city, about 30% of the people in that city rely on some form of woodwork. Some form of woodwork. It could be handicrafts, they could be working in sawmills, but they rely on wood as their livelihood. When this wood is processed, every day all of this waste gets dumped into this landfill. And every day it is burnt with the whole city around it. It is such an amazing sight. The first time I saw it, I was astounded. I was thinking, how can this possibly exist in today's world? But it is there. It is there in front of all of us. And I challenge any of you that if you take a plane and land in Kumasi and you get out of the airport, you will see the mist in the air around the whole city. That is the level of air pollution caused by this. We went to the municipal authority. All our projects in India were private projects. We never worked with the government. We worked directly with farmers. We worked with thousands of farmers. But when we went to Africa for the first time, we went to the government. And we said, what are you going to do about this? They had a lot of high-tech ideas, global companies pitching to come in and set up projects which had been going on for 5 years and 10 years, not getting funding, not getting access to resource. So they had huge problems. So the first thing we did was follow the India approach. We started base on the ground. So we hired 3 people and we said, let us find out the exact maze of how this wood works. So they got into trailers and they followed wood trucks for a whole month. They went into the forest, they saw how the wood was cut, how it was debarked, how it was loaded on a truck, what happened to the waste over there, how it came to the sawmill, what happened to the waste there, how it came to a small artisan, and they were able to map how this wood moves across the city and how it ultimately moves to the landfill. By doing this, what we were able to do is identify geographical clusters where this waste generation was the maximum. And we took the first such cluster and we said, let us set up the plant here. You see some images of the plant as it will look when it is finished. You also see a physical image of what it looks like. This is about a 4-month-old image. We will be starting production in November. It is a 100,000 ton plant. Let me tell you some interesting statistics. All of this product in our current scheme of things will be exported to Europe. When this plant is running, it will become 3% of Ghana's exports by volume, not by value but by volume. It will become about 0.5% of Ghana's GDP in terms of value, and it will become the single biggest project out of Ghana's traditional industries of cocoa, gold and oil and gas. These have been the 3 traditional industries. And it deals with waste. Can you believe this? Here is a project that uses waste and is able to still create such a significant impact. With Ghana again, we are coming now to the next step wherein we are asking ourselves, can this be used locally? It is definitely being made locally, but can it be used locally? We have just introduced our first batch of cook stoves in Ghana. We are doing a pilot around this. If that is successful, then I think in a space of 3 years, all of this product could be displacing gas usage in Ghana. The point I'm trying to make is that if you look at this industry versus, say, the wind industry, if a government incentivizes the wind industry, what is the guarantee that it creates local jobs? Those windmills could be made anywhere. They could be made in China, they could be made anywhere, they could be brought here, they could just be assembled. The real value addition could be happening anywhere in the world. But when it comes to biomass, because of the logistical constraint, because the logistics cost is so high, the industry has to be necessarily local. Secondly, bioenergy is without doubt the highest job creating industry in all of renewable energy. Can you imagine how many jobs are created when 100,000 tons needs to be trucked, the waste needs to be trucked to the plant, the finished goods need to be trucked to the port. There are so many social interlinkages within that it creates a huge number of jobs. And the third point is that this is probably the only form of energy which is directly usable by consumers to replace fossil fuels without government intervention. A country like Ghana does not need the government to announce a very favorable solar policy which is subsidized, which is then questionable to fiscal responsibilities. It is something that is viable today. It is cheaper to be used today. I think this is a promise that we need to reflect on. And here I want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about what Avalon means. The meaning, the technical meaning of the name Avalon is energy from the sun. So when I say this, a lot of people ask me, you are not a solar company, you are a bioenergy company, why did you name it energy from the sun? Right? But if you think of it, what is it that captures solar energy most efficiently in the world today? What is it on earth that captures solar energy the most efficiently? And the answer is a plant. It is not a solar panel. When you look at the efficiency of the photosynthesis process, it is far, far higher than a PV panel. And hence what we have done is we have forgotten what is naturally available as an efficient process, and we are trying to reinvent this process through interventions by modern technology. Modern technology is needed, but it is needed on top of this layer, as a second layer to the natural processes that already occur. Hence when I say Avalon is energy from the sun, it is really energy from the sun. These crops are really grown by the energy from the sun, and the waste really stores this energy from the sun, which we are using again. That is the theme that we are working on. If you look at the extensions that are possible to this theme, this is a project that I want to mention, which is in the city of Ahmedabad, which is a city waste project. Ahmedabad is the 7th biggest city in India. It generates about 4,000 tons of waste a day, and all of this waste is currently dumped in a 90-acre dump yard, on a 90-acre landfill, which has a huge mountain of waste. If you see those pictures today, you would be shocked that how can this waste be dumped in the open. But unfortunately, this is the state of most Indian cities on this day. Hence, we have taken up a project to be able to use this waste in an incineration project, generate combined heat and power. The heat would be sold to industry around it, and the power would be sold to the government. This is another example of how bio-waste can be efficiently used. When we were roaming the villages of Gujarat, we asked ourselves, what is the meaning of agriculture waste? We saw crop waste, we saw livestock waste, but we saw a lot of land being wasted. We saw a lot of land as a resource that was lying barren. Nothing was growing on top of it. And there were strong reasons for that. That land was either very high salinity, it did not have water, it had issues, structural issues in terms of the fertility of the land. And we said that if this land cannot be used to generate food, then can it be used to generate fuel for those communities? Again, we did a very wide search on what are the energy crops being grown globally. So all of us know about grasses, miscanthus, and so many sorghum, and so many crops that are being attempted to be developed as energy crops. But we tried to focus on something that was already existing within that community, and we focused on bamboo. I don't know how many of you are familiar with bamboo. Those of you who are from Asia will be very familiar. Also in Africa, we have seen this grow very rapidly. Bamboo is the single fastest growing woody species of the world. It is also the biggest absorber of CO2 from the atmosphere. In fact, we had done a calculation that if we grow 1 acre of bamboo, then we would be able to make 1 Indian citizen carbon neutral. In other words, because India has a very low per capita CO2 emission, but the CO2 emission per capita of an Indian citizen can be neutralized by growing 1 acre of bamboo. If we think of trees like pine, just as a reference point, bamboo absorbs 4.5 times more CO2 than pine. Very interestingly, even today about 30% of the world's population relies on bamboo as a form of livelihood. They are connected to bamboo. They may be using it for handicraft, they may be using it as firewood, for construction. So a large population is already familiar with the characteristics of this crop. So why not take something that is already deep rooted and try to popularize it? So this is the next project that we have now started. We took a pilot project of about 120 acres, which is now fully planted. It is now mature. It took about 3 years for the crop to be mature. And now we are giving the seedlings to farmers to be grown, where we would be able to buy back the bamboo waste from them. We worked with a solar plant, where we realized that the problem with solar in India is that it is very land intensive. And as I said before, 17% of the population lives in 2% of the land. So there is not enough spare land to be able to set up solar panels. And again we asked ourselves, what was this land before the solar panels came along? And the answer in most cases was agriculture. This land used to be, agricultural land. People used to grow crops on it. And we said to ourselves, can't we continue doing that? Why stop just because there are solar panels on top of it? We also found that a large amount of water is used to clean the panels periodically. And we created a model where we were able to grow stuff below the panels, right at the point where the reject water falls. So when the panels are washed, the water is fed directly to these crops. And there are several varieties of crops that don't need height, that are able to handle shade, that can grow in shade. And this has become a very significant project, also recognized by several multilateral agencies. And the Gujarat government is now drafting a policy where they would incentivize all solar plants to continue with some form of agriculture on that property. We are also working with several futuristic technologies. Algae is one of them. We feel that algae again is something that is grown throughout the world in the wild. It has not been completely domesticated yet, but it is a very large source of the human needs as we know it. It could be a fuel need, it could be need for nutrition, it could be need for cosmetic applications. So there is a wide spectrum of needs that can be done through algae. This is a pilot that is going to come next to one of our power plants. We have a 10 megawatt waste to energy power plant that is running, and this photobioreactor would be right next to it. There would be a loop from the chimney that goes into this reactor so that the CO2 is fed into this algae. The algae also needs some other nutrition, and once the algae has matured, we would be using it for fertilizer to give it back to our farmer communities from whom we collect the waste. So it becomes such a beautiful closed loop process. The farmer gives us the waste generates power, but the waste also generates CO2. That CO2 is used to grow algae, and that algae is used by the farmers. I think there are several of these closed loop equations that are available to us as a world, but we are not able to fully harness them because we don't take a bottom-up view of the situation. We don't understand the realities on the ground. I think the recognitions we have got has been for this method of thinking more than anything else. Yes, we are already a fairly large company. We are now India's biggest bioenergy company. We would be amongst the top 10 in the world. We are probably the only bioenergy company that is working across 4 continents. Most other companies tend to be very local because the nature of business is very local. But I think those are just top line numbers. That is just the scoreboard. If you go beyond this, if you go deeper within this, you will find that there is a pattern of thinking. And it is this pattern of thinking that has led to all the business success so far. And it is this pattern of thinking that is leading us to innovate in the future. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take any questions or comments, suggestions. Yes, please. Yes, I was able to hear the question. So, yes, I could hear the question. Closed loop equations in the UAE. So, I think to identify closed loop equations, a very high degree of local knowledge is needed. So I would not venture a very specific guess because I don't have that extent of local knowledge, but I could give some pointers in terms of how it can be thought through. And I think the first step is to really look at the resource availability in that country. What are the available resources? Is it water? Is it extra land? Is it a lot of people? Is it forestry? Is it biology of some sort? Is it some sort of waste like waste heat? So when you look at a current matrix of resource and its use, you are quickly able to identify what are the wastages that occur here. And when you pick each of these wastages, you are then probably able to identify that the waste of one industry can become the raw material to another process. Now usually that is not a straight equation. You can't take this squarely and dump it on the other guy as raw material. It needs some process. And that is where technology has to come in. Technology has to come in to make it a standard, replicatable and a suitable process to be used as raw material for the next industry. So I think there could be a lot of answers. For example, because the UAE has a high amount of solar radiation, there are bound to be a lot of solar plants that will come up here. When we think of solar electric plants, we think in terms of cell efficiency, right? We think that this cell can convert so much. We don't think in terms of total efficiency. What is the total efficiency? That has to be that on this square meter of space, which is a solar panel, how much solar radiation is coming? And out of that radiation, how much are we really using? And if we are not using some parts of that radiation, radiation is also not uniform. It is divided into various bands. So let's say we are using 2 bands and not using 3 bands. Then can we use those 3 bands? That could be done by growing crops. It could be done just by recovering that waste heat. I saw a very interesting innovation where solar panels are washed with water to reduce the temperature, which increases generation, and the water becomes a source of waste heat. It becomes hot water that is available for various applications. So I think the opportunities are boundless, but it needs a very deep sort of understanding and thought process to be able to do it. Yes, please.
You mentioned your factory in Ghana, which is predominantly, you mentioned you want to use it mostly for export to Europe, but you also mentioned domestic use. What is the philosophy?
So the project, because the project has an economic burden on it, as it were, it needs to be financed and it needs to be built. So the project has been conceptualized as an export project. So when we start production this year, it will start moving to Europe. But our 3-year intent is to, if you look at the use, this is a lead lag cycle. You need to first sell the equipment which will use the pellets, and only then the pellets can be used locally. So the first task is to really develop equipment which is suitable for Ghana. So for example, Ghana has a very large school feeding program. They've given grants to all their municipal schools where they give free fuel. Now if you look at the burden on the government by using gas, it could be brought down by 30% if they agree to use our pellets. But we need to first do a pilot, we need to develop a cook stove that works there. For example, our cook stoves are electric. They have a fan, they have oxygen, so it needs electric connection. Now, if that is not available, then we have to create a solar powered cook stove for the Ghana economy. So we are still developing that, but from a 3-year perspective, I think we could really move most of this pellet consumption to be local. Yes, please.
I'd like to first thank you for a very inspiring presentation.
Thank you.
My question is, you talked a little bit at the beginning about the customizable fertilizer that you use from the agricultural waste, and then at the end you talked about the fertilizer that you generate from the algae. Could you talk about the differences in value between the two and
Sure.
the differences in application?
Sure. So I think we have been very careful not to look at anything as a one-size-fits-all approach. So for example, when we develop customized fertilizer, we look at a banana and we look at what does the banana ultimately have. Does it have zinc? Does it have magnesium? If it has it, then obviously it needs to be fed this mineral or resource to be able to synthesize it. Now today's fertilizers don't address this at all. They address only the NPK need. That's all right, I can. So when we make a fertilizer for banana, it does not come from a single resource. It could, for example, we found that termites were plaguing these banana crops. Now, tobacco dust has an anti-termite property. This has been conventional wisdom for a very long time. In India, if you are passing by a street, you will see a street vendor selling a packet of tobacco dust, which is used by the housewife to fight termites. So our fertilizer has a 10% tobacco dust blend within it. So to answer your question, when we think of algae, algae has, again there are different types of algae and each type of algae has some nutrition content. But the potential of algae lies in the fact that it could become a base material for a lot of these customized fertilizers. So when we think of banana or cotton, all the ingredients don't have to be different. Some has to be a base fertilizer, and then there are other nutritional components that are specific to that crop. So the advantage with algae is that it can become a base material across this.
I have two questions. The first one is that the price of gas is very important for your business. So now, because you're established, so how do you, when you're going into a new market, which are the key factors that you consider before going into that market? And what is the price of gas which you really expect? And the second question is that you have so many different projects. How are you involving the young generation in those projects? Are there any opportunities, any internships? I mean, because a lot of things which we heard today, they are really breakthrough. They are not commonly taught. So it would be great for young people to be involved.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me try to answer the second question first. The only reason why we are able to handle so much diversity as a business, when I said that we are the only company in 4 continents, why are bioenergy companies not able to diversify geographically? Because it needs a lot of local learning. You need to understand, for example, our plant in Canada works with the local loggers there. Now when you work with the Canadian population that works in the forest, it's a completely different mindset. I mean, you cannot imagine how to even converse with them. I have had trouble understanding what a lot of these people try to say. And I've been to the US where you will actually see people wearing cowboy hats in rural areas. So it's very, very local everywhere, right? And the only reason why we are able to handle this versatility is that as an organization, we are extremely democratic. So we empower teams, we put in teams and we tell them this is your job, you have to do it. Fortunately, our mission is so good, so exciting, so fulfilling that we find a lot of young talent which is excited by this and wants to commit to it. If you look at the average age of Avalon, it is below 30. The average age of our 400 people is below 30, which I think is fantastic, which shows that there is a lot of energy in these young people that is waiting to be tapped. We have a lot of structural things we do. We have internships in our research teams. We have field internships where somebody can go to Ghana for a couple of weeks and understand these dynamics, be part of such recce's that I talked about, where you trail the wood and you find out those sort of things. So I think we are very clear that we need young talent to be able to drive this model further. To answer your first question now, we look at 2 things. One, when we enter a country, we look at the availability and the price of fossil fuels, largely gas. and we look at the resource availability locally. What is the biomass resource availability locally? And I think if we find a good convergence between these two, then we think it's a hit point. So for example, if we look at islands typically have a very high energy cost because they are importing everything, but those islands are also doing agriculture. So just to use an example, we are evaluating Fiji very closely right now, the country of Fiji, and that has extremely high energy prices, but it has a large sugar industry. And when sugar is grown, there is a large amount of waste that is generated. So our ultimate mission is to, the first slide that I showed with Mahatma Gandhi, how do we make a local resource be used locally? And how do we displace imports? And when we do that, that is the highest value creation that we can do. Yes, please.
The question is about the standards. I'd like to ask about I'd like to ask about the standards of your pellets that you make. Are they a function of the source of the pellets, and there are challenges regarding standardization when it's coming from different sources?
Yes. To a large extent, it's a function of the source. So, for example, if we take cotton stock, what can we do with it? So we can screen it, right? You can screen it for size. So if there is mud, which is a pollutant, right, which is ash, then you can screen it because it is small. So you can reject it. Similarly, you can reject stones. You can reject on basis of weight. So there are some processes to purify this material. And to a large extent, we are able to bring down the pollutants and standardize it. But there are some things which are just inherent. So for example, if somebody has used a fertilizer which has chloride, then the chloride has gone into the stem because the chloride went in when the plant was growing. So it is now into the molecular structure of that plant, and so it can't be removed. At least today's technology does not allow us to remove it. There are technologies available which may do this also. Hence, in that case, we try to create formulations. So we may use only 20% of that material with 80% of a good material, so that the overall tolerance limit is not breached. So our objective is that the end product needs to be standardized, and for that whatever needs to be done on the back end.
I also believe that you have also done a lot of work to reduce the price of pellets compared, because there are very established markets of pellets in Europe and Canada, and I don't think you are producing pellets at the same price. So how did you go about that?
So I think that was completely driven by our lower logistics cost. So people who make pellets really took the cost of that truck, as I said, which had a half ton, and passed it on to the consumer, which was a big waste. The other thing that we constantly measure is our carbon footprint. So today, to make a ton of pellets, we use about 4% of the energy of the pellet to make the pellet, right? Now when you run empty trucks, when you transport half ton in a truck, that 4% will go up to 10%. You are wasting energy, you are wasting diesel to bring that material to your plant, which is both a cost burden and a carbon burden. So our effort has really been to optimize that process, and that is probably the only reason why we have been able to, that is the biggest reason I would say why we have been able to reduce the cost. The other thing is that because this industry is a little unorganized, a lot of people make adulterated pellets. So we are able to charge so I think our pellets are really value for money. They are not cheap. They are very good quality, so very good heat value. They cause no problems in the equipment, and they are priced on parity to the market. That has really been our strategy.
How much is a ton?
Globally it differs. So in Italy, where we sell, it's about 250 euros a ton. That is the retail pellet. In the industrial sector, it's about 140 euros, 150 euros a ton, which are ship loads and large sizes. And in the Indian context, we sell it for as low as about 130 euros to the retail market. I want to ask, has anybody been to India ever, by any chance? And if you have been to India, you would have seen the street hawkers, the kind of cooking that occurs on the street, and those people have become the biggest adopters of pellets. So that is extremely gratifying, because these people, there are also other equations which are very interesting. To get a gas connection, you need an identity. You need an identity card. So for somebody living in Mumbai who has come from some other state, he does not have that identity card, and hence it's just not possible for him to get a gas connection. So pellets become a locally available unregulated fuel, which is a free to use sort of fuel for these people. So very interesting social dynamics that we see changing with this process. Yes, please.
Going back a bit to your photobioreactor solution, why did you decide to?
Why did you decide for photobioreactors that have a higher cost of installation and capital cost, minus other alternatives, or how did you go about the process assessment to go for microalgae generation about food grade CO2 or high grade CO2 or whatever equipment? What was particular consideration? And second one is, if you could comment a bit on how policy kind of shapes of these decisions. For instance, are we going to use some recombinant strains to increase yield, or are you thinking about just going for natural strains, mixed cultures, pure cultures, if you're going for future pharmaceutical usage for the or something?
Right. So I think when we evaluated algae initially, we came to know very quickly that it's ultimately going to be a source of high value additives. So in the food sector, in the pharma sector, in the cosmetic sector, and hence it required an approach which was a controlled approach. So you can't grow it in open ponds, otherwise you lose the control over the variables that affect its purity. Having said that, I think these are very long research processes to be able to make something qualify as pharmaceutical grade, then to pass through the regulatory approval process and to ultimately be able to do that. And we as a company, we are a for-profit business, so we like to be very nimble. When we put money into research, our first question is when can it start giving cash, and hence we look for interim revenue streams. So I think algae fertilizer for us is a first revenue stream, which is not very high value, but it is immediate, and it fits very well into our ecosystem of agriculture, farmers and so on. In the future, we will be developing other value streams. So far, our focus has really been on the energy value stream. So we have not so far focused on food and pharmaceuticals, but now there is a growing voice within the company that maybe this unit can be spun off and be made an independent algae sciences unit, because the subject is very, very vast.
That's it. We wanted to have the pictures, but we lost most of the ground. This is the last lecture for this academic year. So if you could just come on here for 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for, let's have a